How's it going? Welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Austin, and today I'm going to be showing you guys how to digitally paint in Procreate. Now, if you missed my previous video where we drew this turkey dragon here, we went over how to draw anything in Procreate using basic forms. So if you haven't seen that, go check it out. If not, no big deal. It's fine if you haven't seen that one. But in this video, we're going to use this same drawing to paint it and show you exactly how to get digitally painting in Procreate. Now, Procreate is my personal favorite painting software. I do all of my professional work in Procreate. So if you're wondering, is this really viable if I'm wanting to be a professional artist, or is this just sort of a hobby thing? It 100% is, and there are plenty of other artists who use it as well. There might be some features that require Photoshop, but for the most part, I do almost everything in Procreate. Let's go ahead and get started. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell icon to receive notifications, and also share this with your friends if you have other people who are into Procreate, or you think that their paintings suck. Just kidding. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So first things first, whenever I do a painting, I like to create a shape layer that I can use to either create a layer mask or a selection from, so that I don't have to worry about painting outside the lines for the entire rest of my painting. Keeps everything nice and neat and organized. And so that's what we're gonna do first. So to do that, I have my line art here. It's on its own separate layer. And you can ignore all of these other layers. I've already painted this, so we're going to go through. I'm going to show you how. But first, we're going to start all the way down here by creating a new layer. And the way that we do that is just by hitting that little plus icon at the top. That's going to make a new layer right here. And I'm going to drag this single layer all the way down so that it's my lowest layer in the stack. And now that we have that layer, we can use our selection tool. You can also just paint this in if you want with a nice hard edge brush, but I like using the selection tool because I think it's cleaner. And you're going to come in here, you're going to zoom up real close, and you're going to start basically tracing the outline of this entire image. So you can do this in sections so that if you mess up, it doesn't undo all of your work. Like this. Once you have a selection, you come over here to your color picker, which is this dot in the top right corner of the program, and I like to start with a nice gray color. And you're going to come over here, you drag that circle over from the top corner and drop it in, and it's going to fill that selection that you made. And then you're just going to repeat that process. You're going to go to the next portion, you're going to trace it out, and you can do bigger sections than this, but you're going to trace it out and then drop in the next part, and you're just going to keep going like that. And as you can see, since it's on its own layer, it's underneath the line art. This means that we'll be able to paint a lot easier without having to worry about messing things up, until eventually you have the entire thing like this. As you can see here, my painting is, or my shape layer has been completely outlined, and now everything's ready to start working on. The next thing I like to do for this method of painting, we're going to do what's called the grayscale to color method, which means that we're going to be trying to get all of our values largely in grayscale and then adding color on top of it. It's sort of like a hybrid version of that. But that's the cool thing about digital painting and Procreate, is that there's tons of different ways to go about making a painting. This is just one of them. Probably cover other types and versions in the future. But for today, we're going to do grayscale to color, at least a version of it. So the next thing I like to do, this is a little tip I learned from Hardy Fowler, where we just take a soft airbrush with a lighter gray than our base shape layer. So if I get my airbrush over here, I select the brush icon, go down here to airbrushing on the side, get the soft airbrush, and then I just bring the brightness of my color picked layer up. And we'll also make sure we're selecting our shape layer so we don't go outside the lines, which, let me clarify how I did that. You're going to come to the shape layer right here that we just made. You're going to click on it with one finger, and then you hit select, and it will create this sort of stripy background you see here. And that's going to make it so that when we paint on a new layer, we're not going outside the lines. Everything will stay nice and contained. You can also do this with a layer mask, but I just prefer this for some reason. Old habits die hard, I guess, but either way is totally fine. So once you get that big soft airbrush, we're just going to pop one single brush stroke in right there, and really you can do it wherever you want, but it sort of simulate a little bit of lighting right off the bat. Before we even get to the lighting step, it just makes it feel like there's a light highlighting this one specific area that's sort of coming in. This is the direction that is closest to the light source, so to speak. So, like I said, I already have that one. We've got that there. And the next step is going to be to start adding in our local values. Now, local values are basically, if we turn this thing grayscale, what would, how bright or dark would a certain value be? Would it be black? Would it be white? Would it be somewhere in between? And you want to try and break it down into roughly 10 values, like on a value scale. And from there, you can start to paint in your various values as if you were painting this in black and white image. Now, keep in mind when you're doing this, you're not adding any shadows yet or lighting at all. We're imagining that this is as if it were just sort of a static, two-dimensional image with no lighting whatsoever. So don't be trying to guess shadows or lights or anything like that. You're trying to imagine if it was in a vacuum of light, basically just sort of a perfectly evenly lit ambient light source that showcased just the values, how locally, how dark or light was a certain part of this creature. For example, if we go ahead and turn on like this layer here for the wings, you can see that I just made those a layer lighter because that's what I want the wing membrane to be as a local value. Same with the claws, those are their own layer. The beak and eye is on that layer as well. And these little tines for the feathers themselves. And then another example here is the face. Let's go ahead and paint it though really quick. So let's say we want to do the face. We would just choose our local color, that is gray. Remember, we're not using any color yet. Local value, I apologize. And make sure you remember, we're not doing any shadows, and that you're creating new layers for all of these. The benefit of creating all these separate layers is you can see I can paint right underneath that eye layer that we already did. Same with the beak layer. And basically you just come in and paint whatever you think those values should be. So here's what we have for our turkey. So these are all of our base values. You can see over here we got all the feathers, wings, all of that, right? And like I mentioned, separate layers to keep it nice, neat, and organized. And now we're ready to move on to the next step, which is going to be our shadows. So you're gonna make a new layer, and this one is going to be different than the other layers we've made so far, because if you notice, each of these layers, they have a little letter right next to the checkbox that turns them on and off. That is the layer mode. So let's make a new one. We are going to rename this, or sorry, not rename it. We're gonna change the layer mode to multiply. You can rename it too if you want. We're gonna change it to multiply for our shadow layer. Now what this is gonna do is make it so that it multiplies whatever value we've picked with the values beneath it, while still preserving any sort of relationships between the values underneath it. So, sounds complicated, let's just show you how it works. We have this medium gray here, and when we start to paint on this layer, we're gonna see that as we paint across, it doesn't just completely cover it up, it's not opaque, right? It's almost like a dark highlighter. It's basically multiplying those layers beneath, so the lighter areas will still stay relatively lighter compared to each other, the darker areas will still stay darker, even though the whole thing has been shifted down a couple values. And this is what we're going to use to do our shadows, because it's going to help preserve all that grayscale color work, or not color work, value work that we just did. Let's go ahead and I'm going to use a flat brush here. It doesn't necessarily matter too much which brush you use, but just something that you can have a good control of the opacity on with your pressure sensitivity. And this brush just comes with Procreate, flat brush in the painting section. And you're going to come in and start doing your shadows. Now when you're doing your shadows, something to think about is what direction is your light source coming from. Our light source is coming sort of from wherever this highlight is that we put in earlier, so sort of above and to the front of our creature. And so we want to think about that as we begin to paint in these shadows. Now in this first pass, I'm just going to use one value for the entire layer. I'm not going to be changing this up here to go darker or lighter. I'm just going to stick on the same one the whole time, and then we'll build up more layers on top of that to go darker and erase away to go lighter. So I'm just starting here with this one. A good way to think about it when you're doing shadows is to think about the big major forms first. So for example, I'm just going to paint right over that hand for now because we'll be able to come back and clean it up later, but really I'm thinking about what are the major shapes of this thing first, right? It's basically almost a big meaty ball, and so those are the major forms I'm going to try to take into account when I'm working on painting this. Once you have a You know, you've worked in your shadows, you've taken the time to blend them, smooth them out. What you can do is come back in with your eraser tool. So let's say I just put a soft, gray over this whole section of the body here. I want to bring out these highlights. I could just go in and highlight them one by one in my highlight layer, or I can already start to give some lighting in there with the shadows and sort of imply the shadows and the crevices of these wrinkles by coming in here with my eraser tool and just erasing out from my shadow layer on that really thin sheet of shadow that I did where these different wrinkles and highlights go. It's a bit time consuming, but you're not painting to get it over with. You're painting to make something nice and beautiful, cool, whatever it is you're going for, creepy. So just take your time, you go through there and just sort of erase out all those wrinkles and highlights. Same with like the scales over here, for example. You're not completely erasing them out. You want to have a little bit of shadow space in between because that's what sort of implies that it's raised up. Make sure you're thinking about the direction of your light source, leaving the thicker portion of the remainder of the shadow on the bottom because that's where the shadows would be getting cast. So like the top of the wrinkle or the top of the scale is where it's erased away, and then the bottom a little bit less so in order to help simulate that lighting that we're going for. And you're basically do that over the whole thing. Same with these legs down here and these scales. We're also not worrying about any texture brushes at this point yet. If you want to get adventurous, feel free to, but we're going to keep it simple for right now and come in with the texture later. So let's go ahead and look at the one that I already did. So this is my shadow layer. You could say I went fairly dark to really help push the contrast, and you can see where I erased away these different highlights for the scales and stuff like that. So that's our first shadow layer. Something else you might have noticed is that in our original shadow layer that I just showed you, we used gray. However, if you want, this is sort of setting you up for later, you can use colored shadows, which I typically recommend doing. Colored shadows help sell the lighting of the image more, usually if you either focus on a cool or warm shadows. For this, I did warm shadows, so this sort of like an orange, warmish red. That adds a lot to just, even right now, it's just to sort of bring this thing to life. That's our first layer of shadows. Now, you want to continue to darken it and continue to build up these layers of shadows layer by layer. So the next thing you're going to do is make a new layer, turn it to multiply. I like to use the exact same value I was using before and continue to do the same thing. At this point, you're going to go in and push the darkest areas of shadow, right, down, areas in between the legs will probably get a lot darker. Maybe certain areas underneath the legs or the wings that need darker shadows. And you're going to work it up in layers. So we can see here, same thing, just a few touches behind the neck and the arms in between the legs that we really darkened up. We can flick that on and off so you can see the difference. And then I did it one more time even just to really push some areas that I thought should get darker in between the toes here, the arms, any sort of these wrinkles or crevices where I thought it should just get a little bit darker. So that gets us to our shadow layer, but we still got a lot to do, right? We still have highlights, we still have all of our color, we have all that stuff. So let's go ahead and come back and work on our color now. Hey guys, I just want to take a moment to tell you about my new website, digitalpaintschool.com. So Digital Paint School is my new website where you'll be able to take digital painting courses covering a wide variety of topics. We're going to be teaching environment design, concept art, anime, manga, human anatomy, basically anything you can think of. There'll be multiple instructors on there who are experts in their industry who actually work in the field that they're teaching, and you can even sign up for one-on-one mentorships with any of our instructors where every week they're going to meet with you, they're going to be doing drawovers, paint-ups of your work, talking about your artistic goals, and even giving you specific assignments tailored exactly to what you're trying to accomplish. Also included is access to our private community of artists where you can meet other students who are taking the same courses as you, share your assignments, get feedback, actually interact with your instructors, as well as join fun art challenges and cool art prompts to come up with creative ideas. The whole goal of this website is to help you build a portfolio that's actually going to get you hired in the industry. And the cool thing is there's a 14-day money-back guarantee. So if you buy any of our courses and you just don't like them, you don't feel like it's worth it, you can get a refund for any reason, no questions asked, and you don't even have to worry about it. So if you want to paint images like I do in my videos, then click the link in the description below and go check it out. That's all. Thanks for taking the time to listen. Now back to the video. For color, we are going to create a new layer, and this one we are going to change the mode to color. So We hit the plus sign at the top, it makes a new layer. I'm going to make sure that this layer is underneath my shadows layer. So you can just hold down on a layer and then drag it around with your finger to move it to the correct spot. And I'm going to change the mode by hitting the little N and dragging it down all the way to the second from the bottom color. Now what this is going to do is it's only going to paint whatever color you put on there. It's not going to really affect the value as much, so whatever value is underneath is whatever value it's going to paint with. So for example, even if you come down here really dark red, it's going to basically just pick the hue and the saturation to draw from. So because we're so dark, it's going to be really desaturated, and it's also going to just use whatever is already there. If we pick something really saturated, you'll see it'll be really saturated but still be picking from whatever values we have underneath. And this is what we're going to use to do our entire color layer on. So for example, turkey skin, let's say I want it sort of like this pinkish color. I can come in and start painting it. Can start with big broad strokes and then come in and do individual sections. Say the head I want to be blue like a turkey, and then the chest I want it to be like really red. You basically come in and do this for every portion. Now when you're doing this, you might find that you wanted something to feel like maybe like a really light color, but it's coming out really dark or really saturated. Well, that might be because the value underneath it that you did in your original grayscale value layer is just too dark. How can you fix that? Well, that is why we did all of these on separate layers, because now we can go to any one of these sections and we can lighten or darken it with a hue and saturation slider. So let's show you how I did that. I click on the layer, I come up here to the little wand icon at the top of my canvas, and I click on hue, saturation, and brightness. And now I can just slide this wherever I want to make it either brighter or darker. You probably don't want to go too extreme, but just like a little bit in either direction can help shift it towards the values you want. The other thing that's really great about doing all of these on separate layers is that now I can come down here, and instead of having my whole shape layer selected, I can hit a specific layer like the claws, for example. I tap on it, I hit this select button, and now I can come over here, get a nice sort of pale cream color. Make sure we're back on our color layer. And I can paint these in just the claws without having to worry about, hitting any of these other areas that I already did. Same thing with the wing membranes, let's say. We can hit select, and we can come back up here to our color layer, and we can paint in these wings. I've already done this, same as before. So here is my color layer, and really quick, I'm going to turn this to normal just so you can sort of see what it looks like without the color layer on. And we'll turn off our shadows as well really quick. All right, that's what it looks like, right? It's pretty ugly, pretty messy, and that's okay. It's totally fine because this is really not what we're worried about. We're worried about what the final product looks like. And you can see when we turn it to color, it looks great. It looks fine, right? Especially when we add that shadow layer in. So this is where we should be at this point. You've done your base values in grayscale, we've done our shadows, and we've done our colors. So what's next? Let's move on to the next step. Now that we have all of our colors in, this is where I start to begin to work on some of the more textured marking sort of aspect of things. Some of the markings I put in here on this one was a skin texture, not really a skin texture, but sort of like freckles, sort of, melanistic sort of splotches on the skin. I did the same thing underneath with a lighter sort of mottled palette for the underside. The stripes and markings for the turkey feathers, and this layer here as well to give the feathers more color also. How do we do this? It's pretty simple, but it does require some experimenting. So let's turn these off really quick. Depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish, you might just end up having to flip through layer modes to find one that works, but let's say we want to do this mottled color here on the back. So what I do is I make a new layer, I come up here to my brush selection, and I find something that's going to give me a texture that I want. So can look in the texture side of things. Maybe you want a grunge texture. For me, I want something more, you know, skin or spots. I mean, even maybe this flick brush could work. You got materials, but let's try this. Let's try this rough skin brush and see how it does. Also going to get a darker color here, and we're going to change this layer mode to multiply for what we're trying to accomplish. When I do these textures in Procreate, here's what I usually do. I bring my brush size all the way up and get it pretty large. This might not be a good brush actually. Let's try something else that's a little bit more forgiving. Let's just use this one here, the Flicks one. Okay, so I'm going to turn my brush size all the way up. That might be too big. About there. That looks good. And I'm going to paint in my texture like this. Now it's going to be going outside the lines. It's going to be covering up areas I don't want it to be necessarily, but that's okay because we're going to clean it up here in a second. So once I've done that, it looks alright, but the main problem is that it's not really confining to the form of the creature or the object. It's sort of all over the place. It just looks like it's flat on top of the image, and that's not what we want. I'm going to come over here to my adjustments. I'm going to go all the way to the bottom right above clone and select liquify. And I'm going to use these tools to help me morph and mesh this thing to wrap around the turkey. So how do we do that? We want to treat this thing almost like a sphere in some aspects, since that's largely what it is. But we're going to start with the expand tool and the pinch tool. So the expand tool, I'm going to come here to the center of my image, and make sure that this is blown up fairly large. And I'm going to blow that texture up from the middle so that it sort of gets pushed to the edges a little bit. And that's going to help it replicate this sort of sphere-like feeling. Then I'm going to do my pinch tool, bring it down some, and sort of pinch it along the edges where it's turning away from us the most. You can also use the push tool and do the same thing. We're trying to simulate the feel of things turning, their form turning around the object. So toward the edges, the texture is going to get really condensed and really narrow and tight. And towards the middle is where we're going to see sort of that big blown up shape of it. And so you're just going to work your way around the image. You know, this leg here is a pretty bulbous shape, so we can blow that up down the middle, the arm here. The next thing we can do is use the edge effect, which is really cool because it's basically going to do exactly that. It's going to create an edge. It's going to sort of pinch the texture. So anywhere there's crevices, I'm going to take this brush along those, follow those cracks basically, and it's going to sort of pull the texture into those cracks to help simulate what it would actually be like. I can also do it around the edges, right where that form turns. And you can see that already feels much better as it begins to wrap around the form. All right, now we still have all this overspray. We have this big mess here. Well, we can select our original shape layer. We can come down here to invert. It's at the very bottom, the third option over. We hit invert, and it's going to invert our selection now. And if we come back up to the texture layer we just did, and we get a nice big eraser brush, we clean all that up. That does a lot of the work for us, and now we just have to go in by hand and erase away the parts we don't want to have texture. I recommend using a soft airbrush so that you don't have these hard edges in case it kind of looks weird and wonky. And we just come in here, we don't want this texture on the feathers, you don't really want it on the underside of the wings a whole lot, definitely don't want it all over the face, and probably not so much on the stomach either, because we're going to do a different texture for that. And you just come in and erase away the parts you don't need it. If there's any areas that feel too strong, you can do that as well, or we can just come over here and lower the opacity as much or as little as we want. This is also the stage where you can change the layer mode if you want and see if you find something you like better. Color burn doesn't look bad. Maybe you want this to be the opposite effect where it sort of lightens up. You can do that. Linear light looks interesting. That also actually looks pretty cool. I like divide. But you're going to come in here, find what you like, and then sort of build these up in layers. So you can see here, this is mine. Kind of looks boring now compared to the one we just did, but this one's mine. Then I have another layer underneath for that texture. I went in by hand on a multiply layer and drew in this feathering, and then just did an overlay layer here to adjust some of the colors. There we go. Now we have our markings. What is next? Next, we are going to go ahead and start to erase out some of our line art a little bit. Basically, areas where the line art is sort of distracting, and especially where there's a highlight, is where we're going to erase it out. So like the face area here, this line art is really strong. I usually duplicate my original line art so that I still have that and don't just completely destroy it. So you can see here, this is the new line art. It's pretty subtle, you can barely even see it's in there. I erased it away from the face, stuff like that, so you can see the difference there. Alright, so that's it for this video. We're going to make this into 2 parts. So part 1, we have done our base values, we have done our shadows, we've done our color. In the next video, we're going to go over how to do all the highlights, the lighting effects, and any other special effects to bring us to our finished image. So eventually, once we get everything said and done, we should have something that looks like this once we're all finished. We'll continue that one in part 2, and like I said, if you're new here, be sure to subscribe. And if you're not new here, if you've been here a lot but haven't subscribed, do that too, and let me know in the comments what sort of tutorials you want to see more. I want to try and make stuff that you guys find useful, and I know I'm making the one for drawing things from different angles. I will get to it. So anyways, once again, thanks for stopping by, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye.